Brainspotting is a psychotherapy that has applications that go well beyond the field of psychotherapy into performance, health issues, creativity, and actually learning and issues of business. So it's really quite all-encompassing because it has to do with the brain and the body, which everybody has and is engaged and applied with everything that we do. We call it a brain-body mindfulness-based relational therapy, and that's a mouthful. But what that does is it really covers everything that really needs to be a part of psychotherapy. Brain-based, well, the issues that people bring to psychotherapists are issues that are carried in their brain that have not been processed through or resolved. Body is where we experience everything that goes on emotionally. In fact, everything that goes on in the brain is felt in the body, and everything that goes on in the body is felt in the brain. So that's a crucial and necessary access point to the brain and to what goes on there. Mindfulness-based, everybody knows how important mindfulness is for healing and for growth and for spirituality. We use a very focused form of mindfulness in the context of Brainspotting. And relational, that's really the most important, because most technical therapies really don't give much attention to the relationship. And if the therapist works relationally, it's because that's who they are. It's not because it's part of the therapy. In Brainspotting, the relationship is the foundation of everything that we do. I actually discovered Brainspotting while working with an athlete, an ice skater, and I was working with eye movements. But what happened was, at a certain point, I saw such a profound wobble and then freeze at that point that instead of moving, I just held my finger there, and she was looking at my finger and really resolved in 10 minutes things she hadn't resolved in a year before that. That is an eye position, and we call it a relevant eye position because any place that you focus and gaze will give you a focused reaction. But a relevant eye position is an eye position that correlates with something that's held deeper down in the brain, which is affecting a person in a way that you wouldn't be able to get to with the focus and accuracy otherwise. That was the beginning in Brainspotting. And it really evolved into finding many different eye positions, ways of accessing through visual reflexes, through visual orienting, and also just through visual gaze that is natural and spontaneous. We found many different ways of using eye positions to access unprocessed trauma or other deeper issues that are held in the brain. And at this point, I'll introduce the brain so I can be clear about what I'm saying. We generally think about the brain in terms of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere when we talk about parts, but we look more deeply into it in terms of not just the left and right, but in terms of three parts of the brain. The brainstem, or the reptilian brain, all reptiles have. On top of that is the mammalian brain. It's also called the limbic brain, which is where a lot of emotions are and also response to potential threat. All mammals have this limbic mammalian brain that sits on top of the reptilian brainstem. On top of that, we have the neocortex, which only primates have, and humans have the most developed neocortex. This is where all thought, language, planning, analysis, time orientation is held. And so for humans and primates, the neocortex sits on top of the mammalian limbic brain, which sits on top of the reptilian brainstem. So for our purposes, we talk about the neocortex, and we talk about everything that's below the neocortex as the subcortex. In the context of therapy, and particularly in terms of trauma, when a person is traumatized, the incredible processing ability of the brain is overwhelmed, and the traumatic experience is not fully processed through. So remnants of the trauma are left unprocessed in the brain. But the key thing is they are primarily in the subcortex, below the neocortex. What are the implications of that for psychotherapy? Talk therapy engages the neocortex because that's where language is. There is no language and no thought processes in the subcortex. There's no time in the subcortex. Why is this particularly relevant? Because information tends to flow up in the brain from the subcortex to the neocortex. Very little information flows from the neocortex down, and the information that flows down from the neocortex is coming off of the information that flowed up. So everything's source is coming up this way. This is where brain spotting comes in. Brain spotting, by just going with eye positions, aims to bypass the neocortex to get focused access to the subcortex, to find those remnants of unprocessed trauma, to hold the brain's focus on them, and to help the brain to process it through in the present in a way that it couldn't process through back at that time. Brain spotting makes use of the uncertainty principle. The name uncertainty principle comes from quantum physics and Werner Heisenberg, but we use it in the context of the therapist sitting in front of a client who has a virtually limitless, infinite system in their brain, 1 to 4 quadrillion connections, which is essentially infinite. So in that context, the therapist sitting in front of the client is truly sitting in a state of uncertainty. The thing is, most therapists don't really know that or find that very challenging, because how can you work with a person in the context of uncertainty? Well, in brain spotting, we use what's called dual attunement, and we call it the dual attuned frame. This is the way we engage the client. Dual attunement, we have the relational attunement, which is a frame unto itself, which is the core of all healing processes. And on top of that, we superimpose the neurobiological frame, which has to do with body awareness and also visual cues and visual reflexes. Both are attuned to the person, both attuned to the person in the moment, and both do not require the therapist to know anything about the client. But when you set and hold this dual attunement frame with the client goes into processing, which we call focused mindfulness, going back to the mindfulness I mentioned, where the brain is literally in the process of figuring out, not logically, but experientially, how to heal from this process. And the brain knows how to do it given the right circumstances, and the dual attunement frame provides those circumstances. Brain spotting gives great attention to how the brain works. And as a clinical process, whatever we do has to align with what we understand about the brain. So we have been looking into the brain, and we've been doing it now for quite a number of years, to try to understand how brain spotting works in the brain. The first true neurological theory had to do with getting direct access to the midbrain. Now, the midbrain is a small but crucial structure at the top and the back of the brainstem. The midbrain has a number of different substructures in it: the superior colliculi and what's called the PAG, the periaqueductal gray. For our purposes, this theory looks into the superior colliculi, which has different sensory layers. The top sensory layer of the superior colliculi is visual. So this original theory is that because we're working with eye positions, that brain spotting hypothetically gets access to that top visual layer in the superior colliculi and finds the right file of information, and by maintaining the eye gaze and the processing, the mindfulness on the eye gaze, results in keeping that same file open. Now this is, most of you or many of you have not heard of the superior colliculi, might not even heard of the midbrain, or thought it was more what we call the limbic brain or the mammalian brain, but it's this crucial structure here. Antonio Damasio said that the midbrain is the seat of the self, the core of the self. But that's how crucial it is for the core sense of who we are, and for the bottom substrate of processing experience. In science, one theory leads to the next, and theories are built upon the other, or a theory will actually replace or refute another theory. Well, our theories have really just built on each other to this point. The most current way that we look at the brain is in terms of the brain and its capacity for regulation. The brain is always, and just as the body, when I say the brain, it really goes to the body, and the nervous system is not just the brain, it's down the spine and to the peripheral nervous system, the nerves that go throughout the body. But it's always either in regulation or seeking to come back to regulation. And it does this intuitively, and this comes from our animal heritage. Animals know how to do it even better than humans do because our neocortex tends to get in the way and confuse our deeper systems. But what happens is when a person comes to a psychotherapist's office, they're actually coming because they're in a state of dysregulation, and they are not on their own able to move out of dysregulation towards regulation. Our primary theory is that trauma, unprocessed trauma, blocks this. And one thing that goes along with trauma is dissociation. You will always find dissociation with trauma and trauma with dissociation. Dissociation in the brain is really barriers that the brain sets up, and it sounds simple or clear, but it's really very complex. But these barriers tend to keep away information from the rest of the brain that is just too painful or overwhelming. So it's highly functional on the one hand, but on the other hand, if you've had a lot of trauma, especially early developmental trauma in childhood, these dissociative barriers form so that certain aspects of the brain that are holding this trauma you cannot get access to. So in that context, those dissociative barriers that are formed in trauma, especially early in life and as we develop, are the blocks for the brain to be able to do its work to come out of dysregulation into regulation. As I said, when people go for therapy, they're really going because something doesn't feel right. Something as far as how they feel, something as far as how they do, how they act and behave, or something in terms of thinking processes or how people are in relationship or how they function at work. And most times we work out our problems well enough on our own. In other words, we're able to come to enough of a regulation and come out of dysregulation. Whether it's for brain spotting or any other therapy, this is what people present to us. The job of the therapist is to really help the person systemically move out of dysregulation and come towards regulation. That sounds easy. Talk therapy, the relational aspect of talk therapy helps with that, but it doesn't really get to those dissociative barriers that are holding that unprocessed trauma in the subcortical brain. Brain spotting is not the only therapy that does that. Brain spotting does it in its own unique way, and that has to do with the precision of how we find the eye positions, the brain spots, and then how we process or use mindfulness off of those brain spot eye positions. Just to take the neuroanatomy a little bit further, and for some of you, you already know this, and for some of you, you've kind of heard it. For some of you, you may have never heard it. Either way, just follow me on this journey, and you'll take out of it what you take out of it. Damir Del Monte, who is a German brain scientist, was born and grew up in Croatia, has studied with the great brain scientists of Germany and of Europe, and he has brought some crucial information to us in brain spotting, and he continues to work with me and others in brain spotting. And he looks really at the areas of the brain that are involved in regulation, and he also looks at the areas of the brain that are not involved in regulation. The esocortex is the term that he uses and that's used in Germany and other circles for the neocortex. But the esocortex actually has more than one aspect to it. And it has to do with the layers. They call them lamina. That's the fancy word for layers that scientists like to use. And in this part of in the right prefrontal cortex, which is they call the granular esocortex, there are 6 layers. The 4th layer is the granular layer. Why is it called the granular layer? Because the brain cells, the neurons, have a very tight, small shape to them, and they're packed tightly together in certain patterns. And this granular esocortex has that granular layer, and it is highly involved in processing high-order information. Information comes up from the thalamus, which is really a central switching station that gets all the sensory information, and then it routes it out throughout the brain. But the thalamus routes information directly into this fourth granular layer of the granular esocortex. And a lot of it either goes up for the higher order processing, or it goes down to the bottom two layers for the processing that goes on there. Why is this so important? Because this part of the brain is not involved in regulation. It's got other more important things to do that are assigned to it, which are the processes of thinking and language and analysis and having a true orientation to where we are in time and in space, but from a thinking, high-level human point of view. The agranular esocortex is more over here. It's more towards the middle and lower down. And in this, it's still part of the neocortex. They call it agranular because it doesn't have the granular layer. Okay, it has 5 layers or 4 layers or 3 layers depending on where it is. So you might think that this part of the brain, the agranular esocortex, is at a loss because it doesn't have the granular layer. Well, it doesn't have it because it's not supposed to have it. In our evolution as a species, certain parts of the neocortex need this granular layer, and certain parts really need to not have it. Why do they need to not have it? Because these parts of the brain are not involved in that higher order process. These parts of the brain are much more involved with regulation. And this part of the brain communicates with the limbic system, that mammalian brain, the fight-flight part of the brain, and it even communicates directly with the brainstem. And if you even look at it positionally, the agranular esocortex, which is over here, is very close to the amygdala, which is the central alarm box of the limbic system that sets off this sense and gives all the signals to the brainstem and the body to prepare for potential danger. So this part of the, and by the way, I'm going somewhere with this. This part of the neocortex or the agranular esocortex is very involved in regulation. One more aspect to this, which is going back to the limbic system. It used to be thought that we used to talk about the cortex and the subcortex, but Damir and other brain scientists in Europe really saw that the limbic system has its own cortex. It's called the limbic cortex. Damir calls it the allocortex, and the allocortex is almost transitional up into the higher neocortex. But the allocortex, which is this ring around the limbic system, this limbic cortex, and some people say that the agranular esocortex and the allocortex are really the same, one and the same, when they work together. The allocortex is very involved in regulation. Regulation meaning that which goes on lower down. So, I said before, I'm going somewhere with this. For a psychotherapy to be successful, it has to be able to bypass the granular esocortex, because the granular esocortex is not involved in regulation. And it has to be able to access the agranular esocortex and the allocortex, because they are involved in regulation. So Damir's concepts about how brain spotting works has to do with the capacity for us to go from a client who's activated, and we find out where they're feeling the activation in the body, and then we find the eye positions that correlate to that activation, either through reflexes, you go over here and a person's head goes back, or you go over here and a person feels it the most viscerally, or as the person's talking about it, they just lock on a spot on the ground, and they talk to this spot on the ground, because that gets access to this. So the concept here, as we put these pieces together, is that brain spotting has the capacity to bypass the parts of the brain, the parts of the neocortex that are not involved with regulation, and get access to the parts that are involved in regulation. Now I'm going to take this a step further, and this is something I haven't really talked about before. In more recent conversations with Damir, he talks about the fact that the limbic system, which is seen in an artificial way as being separate from the brainstem, that the limbic system actually has access down into the brainstem. So not only does the limbic system have a cortex, which brings it up towards the neocortex, the limbic system also is involved in brainstem activity. So when you recognize this access to parts of the brain that are involved in regulation, you see it not only can get into the amygdala and the limbic system, the thalamus, and all these limbic structures, it can actually get direct access into the brainstem. And that also goes to, we don't have time for this today, but that also goes to the PAG, the periaqueductal gray, which is very involved in the deeper kinds of regulation of body processes, especially having to do with pain, which we know is physical pain, but also emotional pain is felt as physical pain, and it also has to do with the processes in the PAG.